Hello, and welcome back to Friday Vinyl Club, where every day feels like a Friday and every album tells a story. I'm Jamie, and each episode I invite a guest to bring along a special record, an album that didn't just play in their life, but shaped it. This isn't about chart positions or critical reviews, it's about personal soundtracks, the records that stay with us long after the needle lifts. This episode, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Lulu from London. I first met Lulu through our mutual love of Split Enz, Crowded House, and the wider Finn universe, so music has always been a huge part of our conversations, and I've been really interested to hear which album she'd bring along today. This episode, she's chosen something iconic, ambitious, and often misunderstood, White Feathers by KAJAGOOGOO. But before we dive into the album and why this record matters to Lulu, let's rewind a little. Lulu, welcome to Friday Vinyl Club. How are you feeling today?
I've been really good, thank you very much. The sun's shining, been out to a country house and walked around the garden and have a lovely time, so I'm all good.
So, you've thrown a bit of a curveball here because when I think of you, my friend, I associate you with either Crowded House and Neil Finn or spending hours and hours in the new Victorian Albert David Bowie Museum. What was the thinking behind bringing KAJAGOOGOO?
I won't lie, it's not my most favourite album ever. It's not my go-to if I've got nothing else to play or, it really isn't. But when I thought back of albums that, there's a lot of albums that could have been here instead, probably Scary Monsters, or Gentlemen Prefer Polaroids by Japan, or Mask by Bauhaus, or albums by the Bee Gees like Main Course or Spirits Having Flown or Clues by Robert Palmer or Exodus by Bob Marley. Those are albums that I really remember that I've played to death. But did they lead me on to anything else? And they sort of didn't, I can barely remember a time when I wasn't a Bowie fan. And, being a Bowie fan, I think it gives you a certain attitude towards life and general as well as music. But it would never have occurred to me to try and trail David Bowie all around the country. And also, I'm still in touch with a lot of the band from KAJAGOOGOO, and I do have a personal relationship with a lot of them. So, and other people that I met through them. So that's why it's very personal to me. And actually, the other thing about it is it's not as hideous as some people might think.
I know you're a regular listener of the podcast, and thank you for that. And as you'll know, we like to start with early musical memories. What did the music sound like in the house as you were growing up, Lulu?
Well, I am a born and bred South Londoner, born in Camberwell, but pretty much raised in Brixton. So I probably grew up being a South London soul patroller, as we called them. My mother liked music. She insisted that we always listen to the top 40 on Sundays. It was the radio show then. As I got older, I listened to it on Tuesdays as well so that I could find out what the chart positions were. But, it was religion in my house. The other religion was Top of the Pops, which was always watched. There was no discussion about it. I don't think there was ever a time when that was not turned on. It wouldn't have mattered if the Lord himself had decided to make a TV appearance on the other side, we would not have missed Top of the Pops. My mother liked jolly tunes, is what she used to call them, like Puppet on a String or Delilah or Obla D. And the first song I really remember, sorry, David Bowie, is Laughing Gnome, really, to be fair, which when you're a small child, I mean, that was the sort of song that you loved. And then I remember Space Oddity because they played it all the time. And I remember all those endless hours of watching the television and just a picture of the sky is all I really remember while they were waiting for the lunar module to come back down and, those sort of things. And, when I got old enough to like my own music, it was a bit of, taping off the radio.
Did your mum and dad listen to vinyl?
There were records in the house, but I wasn't really allowed to touch them.
So, can you remember the first vinyl record you bought?
So the first single I ever remember buying was the theme tune to Black Beauty, which is called Galloping Home. And then I love Sweet. I think that I bought a copy of Ballroom Blitz. That was probably my first proper pop record single that I bought. And my mother occasionally let me use the record player to play them. And then I bought, I'm sorry, my street cred is so going to be gone by the end of this podcast, Jamie. I can't even begin to tell you. Probably the first album that I bought was out of a bargain bin at Woolworths, and it was the Bay City Rollers' Once Upon a Star. And
Wow.
I was older then, so I managed to play that quite a lot till my mother got so irritated. And it had this really great cut sleeve, so it had the cut picture of the band on the front, and then it had 5 inserts in it, each one with a sort of face picture of each one of the bands. And when I was like, I suppose 10, I mean, I just thought that was amazing. By the time I became a teenager, and I was taping off the radio even more, I'm going to say that probably about 1979 was a really big musical change for me because a couple of things happened. Um, I was hanging around with a lot of older people, teenagers, because they all rode at the same riding school as me. And one of them came down and he said, with his tape, and said, "You've got to listen to this. I've just taped it." And it was Rapper's Delight, which was not a chart record at the time. And I'd never heard anything like that before. And even though I had sort of grown up with, in Brixton hearing Bob Marley and Aretha Franklin, and I'd never heard anything like Rapper's Delight, and I loved it. I can't begin to tell you. Um, and the other thing that happened was in 1979 was my best friend of the day taped off the radio off the John Peel show late at night, and she said, "You've got to listen to this." And it was Bela Lugosi's Dead by Bauhaus. That was another record. I'd never heard anything else like that. And it only came out on 12-inch vinyl at the time, which was another astonishing thing. And I had to go into a mission up to the King's Road to buy that because you couldn't just get it, in a regular shop. And that was a massive, because that opened my world up to a whole load of alternative stuff that even David Bowie had not quite gone there. So I heard Bela Lugosi, and that introduced me to things like Kraftwerk, John Fox. Also in 1978, my mother started working as the night manager at the Rock Garden in Covent Garden, which was a small venue. It was open 24 hours. And in Covent Garden, round the corner, was a club called the Roxy, very famous in punk circles. And the reason that that's important is that, and another club also closed there was called Hell. The reason that these things are important is that the people that used to come out of there and go into the Rock Garden for, I suppose they called it breakfast at 4 o'clock in the morning, were people like Steve Strange, Rusty Egan, George, who wasn't called Boy then. And my mother was coming back in 1978, 1979, and she was with all these stories of these fabulous people wearing all these fantastic clothes. Then they opened a new club in 1979 called Blitz, and she took me because she was invited to the opening night. So all of those things happened, and those things were a massive, massive influence on me that I can't even begin to explain.
Wow.
Because it was from going from Top of the Pops and watching, I mean, the late 1970s, music-wise on Top of the Pops was not to be written home about, is all I can say. It was very middle America. There was a lot of disco, but disco wasn't Studio 54 disco. It was the disco duck and all hideous things. And so going from that, age 14 and being influenced by David Bowie, and about pretty much the same time is I've suddenly discovered there was alternative London. So that's when I got up to being a teenager. And by then I had a record player of my own.
So are you starting to follow any one trend at that point, or are you just hopping from Rapper's Delight, Bay City Rollers and Steve Strange and whatever Boy George was doing? Are you just picking up anything that's coming along?
A good tune was quite important to me. But with the alternative scene, it was so exciting then. I just loved it. And I sort of went there. And the other thing that happened with my mum being at the Rock Garden is about the same time as she took me to Blitz. I can't remember which came first. And about the same time as hearing Bela, my mother came home with a flyer from the Rock Garden. She used to bring them home every week, and it was a list of the bands who was going to be on, just for me to look at, because I was 14. And it just happened that week after I heard Bela, Bauhaus were on at the Rock Garden, and I begged and begged and begged, and in the end she let me go, and I stood at the back and behaved myself. But it was just so monumentally different to what you were hearing um on the television, on most of the radio shows. It was so exciting. And so that was really my love then. But the thing is that most of those bands, not all of them, but most of those alternative bands were much better on record than they were live. A lot of it was to do with the music. It was, synthesized and very produced. I went to see other live bands, and I remember going to see Earth, Wind and Fire and people like that. And I still loved all of that. But the live performances, in general were just, you never saw it on television. Pete Murphy in Bauhaus, he was just something else as a frontman. Depeche Mode, they looked about my age, so I was really, going to the pub to see them, it was like going to the end of the world. And that really was, record-wise, that was really what I bought, although I never quite got away from the Soul Patrol thing, because I remember being at a party the first time MTV played Thriller. Oh my God. What was that? That was just like an amazing video. So it was a different world then anyway, so it was hard for me to completely disregard one category. And I've always been a little bit like that, really. But for me, the outstanding thing is a really good tune. And I like people that can play their instruments, and I like people that can sing a bit themselves, It's not all about the record for me. They have to be able to do it live too.
I think I've read some of the sort of backstories around the Blitz nightclub and the acts that are coming out of it, and some of the comments around, as you say, from a live perspective, they maybe weren't as good as they were on the overly produced records. But so you were actually seeing live music relatively young then. What?
14. I was not 15 for a few months after that, which is why me being at Blitz was a bit of a legend until one of the photographers was there, just happened to post a photograph on his website or something, and a friend sent me a message and said, "Is this you?" So then everyone had to shut up about me being at Blitz when I was 14, because there was the photographic evidence. But yes, but I absolutely loved gigs, and that is another reason why I did not become quite such a hardcore clubber as some. I grew up with people, going to clubs with people like Mark Moore, who was in S Express and has become a really, really, well-known, producer and DJ. And, I remember going to see Kraftwerk, and ended up sitting next to Rusty Egan. And, I saw a lot of bands, because they were all part of that scene. I saw a lot of bands like Human League and Depeche Mode, and Depeche Mode before they even had a proper record deal. Blancmange, they were not Soft Cell. I saw all those people live really early, and I loved going to gigs. Being a school child, I could not afford to do two things, so sometimes if I went to a gig, I could not go clubbing. And so I was a little bit of a half and half person, whereas my clubbing friends tended to be, and don't get me wrong, sometimes at clubs, we would get bands, there was a really good club on Tuesday nights at Heaven. I saw Culture Club there when they first started, Spandau Ballet. They had a band on there quite often. And the other thing about the alternative bands was that they were cheap, because they didn't have record companies, so they were cheap to go and see.
Was that your life then for your sort of teenage years, going from different club to club, watching these, I guess, new wave bands coming through and trying to see as many as you could? Or was it just a case of if you knew somebody was playing, you'd find your way to get in?
Well, there was a bit of that as well, the finding your way to get in. They used to call it a ligger is what they used to call people that would go to gigs and blag their way in, right? So I was quite good at that. But I was living in London, and by the time I left school, and I left school virtually immediately at 16, I went to work in a stables in London. I'm horse mad for people that haven't met me. And I went to work in a stables, and the thing is about working with horses is that, it's an early start really, and a long day and a lot of physical labour. And the thing was with clubbing was that I would go to a club and I'd get the night bus home, and 2 hours later I had to be working. For me, it was much better going to gigs if I had, if it was like a Friday night, because the weekends were always so busy. If it was a Friday night, I'd be much more likely to go to a gig because they finished earlier, could get the regular bus or train home. But I couldn't really choose what I liked the best at that time. And I did spend all of my wages and my pocket money on going to gigs, and obviously along with that you buy records, but I was never really a single buyer because I couldn't really afford to buy a lot of singles. It was better for me to wait for an album and buy that, because um there were some things that came out. Rapper's Delight would be one thing, Bela Lugosi was another. There were things that came out as singles on 12-inch, and they only came out on that. And Bela was never part of an album at that point, so if you wanted to listen to it, you had to buy the single, and off so I did. But the buying albums was it came along with all of that because I didn't have that much money, so economically it was better for me to buy albums than buy singles.
Yeah, more music for your money, aren't you? In parallel with
Yeah.
all of these names and all of these different genres and bands, you've had this burning love for David Bowie. So,
Oh, I do.
so that stemmed from your mum.
Yeah, sort of it did, because as I said earlier, I loved when I was a child, The Laughing Gnome was one of those records, and then Space Oddity. Um, and then as we were watching Top of the Pops one night, and my mother came in and she said, "Oh, I do love the colour of their hair." She said, "Is that a man or is it a woman?" Shortly there afterwards, she dyed her hair that orangey auburn that David Bowie was wearing in that particular Top of the Pops appearance. It was the Starman one that everyone says they watched. If they all did watch it at the time, the audience would have been about 50 million. So he's always been there. By the time I was 14 and going to Blitz, I had all David Bowie's, albums up until that point. And the other thing about David Bowie was he was born in Brixton, like myself, and he was schooled in Beckenham, where it's where I ended up going to school. So I always loved that. And in a lot of his records, he sounds really South London. He doesn't have that American twang. So he influenced just everything. And I was very lucky to get tickets for Serious Moonlight tour. By this point, a very close friend of mine, who was a musician, one of her friends started playing bass for David. And in the 90s. So when he toured, I was very lucky. I got to go to multiple gigs on tours when he was doing them, because Gail used to put us on the guest list. I missed the 1990 Sound and Vision tour because I was smashed up in hospital. I was cycling up to a lecture in Newmarket and some car just smashed into me. So I had a fractured skull, multiple lacerations, broken right leg, fractured, broken ribs. I was in a right state, but I missed going to see David Bowie because of that. So that's the thing that I mostly hate about that car driver, is missing that tour.
I
Because
can imagine.
that tour was the one where he said that he was not going to play any of the old songs after that. That was that one, right? So he did relent on that, but at that point he said he was not playing any more of the old tunes after Sound and Vision. So I'd never met him, right? So at this point, so I'd never met him. So and I'd been to several gigs with this friend of mine. On one of these gigs, this was at the Hanover Grand, and Gail said, "Oh, come up to the bar afterwards to have a drink." And we went to the bar, and the bar was tiny. I'm sitting in my front room now. I've got a quite large front room, but this bar was the size of my front room. And we're sitting there. The door across from me, everyone else has got their back to the door. The door opens, David Bowie walks in, and my mouth, I've just stopped talking. My mouth has dropped. And Gail's just turned around and said, David, come over here and meet my friends. Yeah.
No way.
Yes. Way. And I'm not going to, I haven't had children, and maybe even if I had, but this, honestly, it is the best moments of my life. It is the most important thing that's ever happened to me. Having a conversation with David Bowie. He shook my hand. He admired my outfit because I was going to see him. I'd put on the whole proper, gear. And do you know what? it's just the best thing. And he was so lovely and he was charming. And he said, "You sound like a South London girl." And I was, "I actually am." And, it was just like, it was brilliant. It was a few moments, a few minutes of conversation, and it was just the best.
Oh, that must have been, I mean, that's a full circle moment for you, isn't it? So when did KAJAGOOGOO'S start coming onto your radar?
Oh, you see, now this is, and they know this. I'll send to the ones that I'm still in touch with. I'll send them the link to this podcast and whatever, because they'll probably be quite amused, and they know all this. So I'm not saying anything that they don't know. I went to see Duran in 1981 with their first tour, and outside, it never really occurred to me to hang. I was early for some reason, and I was sort of milling around outside, and I met a couple of girls outside. One of which was called Debbie. Debbie ended up being a very, very great friend of mine, and sadly, she died in recent years unexpectedly. But I met Debbie outside this gig, and she said that they were going to go and wait round the back and see after the gig and see if they could see the band, and what it was Hammersmith and whatever. And actually, we didn't meet the band on that occasion. But I kept meeting, when we got chatting, and she introduced me to some other people she knew, one called Kathy and one called Vonnie. And they were from Birmingham, and they were like original Duran fans. And they were like on the guest list, which really was not something I massively knew about in 1981. Although I'd been to see Spandau Ballet with my mother at a record company gig, and we'd been on the guest list for that. But, so anyway, we met Kathy and Vonnie, and they were, from Birmingham, and they knew the band from, year dot and whatever. And so that introduced me to a different way of thinking about gigs. So anyway, there were a lot of Duranis, and by the following year, which was 1982, Duran were taking over the world pretty much, and there were loads of Duranis, like loads of them. And I wasn't that mad on Duran. I quite liked them, but what I really liked was the socialising with the fans, which I discovered that I really enjoyed that, and sitting around and chatting, and then I went to see a band called Fashion, who had a really great guitarist called Mulligan, who was so cool looking and also very handsome. And I went to see them at, I'd seen them elsewhere, but I went to see them at Hammersmith Odeon. And this would be about October-ish, 1982. And I got there early enough to see the support band, who were way too poppy for me. And, but they were slick, and they could, they were tuneful, and I didn't really hate them. So that was like then. And then about a month later, Duran toured, and we all went to the hotel where they were staying to mingle around and see if we could meet them and the hotels, I was quite striking, is how I'm going to put it, compared to most fans, because being a clubber, I was not a jeans and t-shirts girl, and the hotels used to just let me in. I think they always thought I was with the bands. So I was sitting in the lobby of this hotel, and Nick Rhodes came back after the gig. For those that don't know, he's the keyboard player with Duran, and he was with this guy, and he said, "Oh, hello," because he'd met me a few times by then, and because I was looked like I did, people tended to remember me. And he introduced me to this guy, and he said, "Oh, this is Chris. He is the lead singer in a band that I'm producing." And I looked at this guy, and I said to him, "Did you support Fashion about a month ago?" And he said, "Yes, we did." And I said, "So what's your band called?" And he said, "It's called KAJAGOOGOO, and I prefer to be called Lamal." And I was like, "Okay." So I was thinking, like, okay. So that was then. And then when I left the hotel, I suddenly thought to myself, do you know what? There's millions of Duranis, and people like Japan, who are about to split up, and the cool clubbing bands. I couldn't imagine myself fangirling with any of them. I mean, not that David Sylvan from Japan would ever want to speak to fans anyway. He was kept himself to himself. But I was not that interested in being a fangirl, being one amongst millions. And I thought to myself, if Nick Rhodes is producing this band, if I find where they're making this album, I will be the first. I will be the original one. Because I was like an original fan there with Depeche Mode, if you like. I mean, I was there when they were playing, clubs with 200 people in them. But I was too young then, and as I said, I didn't really realise until I met, Debbie and Kathy and Bonnie and people. I didn't really realise this whole fan thing was going on. So I thought, I'll find them. So these days you'd get in trouble for these sort of things. But anyway, I went to found a phone book, a couple of London phone books. Those were things that we had before the internet for all you youngsters out there. And I looked for in the yellow pages, and they would have a section for recording studios. And I just started ringing all the recording studios and asking for members of this band. Who they'd said when I was chatting to them, they'd said that they were signing to EMI. So I'd written to EMI, as you did in those days, and said, could you send me the information about this band? And they would send you like a fact sheet and a photograph probably. And you could do that for virtually any band. So I knew who all the band people were. And so I was ringing around all these, recording studios, and I would just say, can I speak to Stuart or can I speak to Jez? Because I figured that would be much more credible than speaking to Lamal. You see, that's what I thought. And eventually I got to one of the studios, which is no secret. It was Utopia, which is now still there, Utopia Studios, but it's now used as like a 1980s, 1990s studio time capsule. If you want to record vintage style, that's where you go. And I rung the studio, and the receptionist just said in a jolly voice, oh yeah, hold on a minute, I'll just put you through. So I just sort of slammed the phone down. And then this was about, I'm going to say, this was before Christmas. So it all happened really quite quickly. And then for the next 3 or 4 months, every spare moment was spent at Utopia pretty much, unless I was at a gig watching someone else. And of course, I had to take a friend with me because I wasn't going to be sitting outside with my friend Linda, who I'm still in touch with, still one of my best friends. And then I did tell a couple of other people, so my sister and some other girls that I've met at Duran, Julie, Joe, and Sam. Sam, sadly, is another person who passed away since then. So all of these memories are all connected with this, record. And we got to the point where, the band, when they'd worked on a track, they'd invite us in. They'd say, "Oh, I'll come in and listen to what we've just done," and it was all very jolly and friendly. But nobody else was there. It was just there was about 7 of us that were regular people, and all led by me. And then I think it was in about March of '83 they released their first single, and it went to number 1, and it was Too Shy, which was not a hideous single. And actually, I love Too Shy. I mean, it's a great pop record. There's nothing about it that is not great. It's just got really easy lyrics that everyone can understand them. It's not political. It doesn't really have a particular message. It's just great bass line, great guitar. It's still being played now. People hear it. They still know it. It's 45 years down the line. They would not even know another single ever released by that band, and they'd know that one, so that was what happened. And the thing about the release of Too Shy is that when it came out, it very kindly said on the sleeve, recorded at Utopia. So from that point onwards, there were a lot more people than 7 outside the studios until they finished doing it. And by the time Too Shy came out, I mean, I didn't really even need to buy the album when it eventually got released, because I had pretty much heard everything on it by then. And I remember when their second single was called Utabia, and I remember, going into the studio and they said, "Oh, you must listen to this, and it's a 12-inch mix." And, Nick Rhodes and his then girlfriend at the time, Juliana, I did get to meet him a lot of times and chat to him. And it was all because of him. And I always used to say to KAJAGOOGOO, I've only come here so that I can talk to Nick Rhodes. And I was just, and I've told them that, I've seen several members of the band on occasion, since then. And, I always say, that I only came to see you all because of Nick Rhodes. And anyway, so that was what happens. And do you know what? I look at the tracks on this album, and they are really all a little bit too poppy for me. But, because I really was quite alternative by then, but I didn't hate them all. And, and they used to use the instrumental KAJAGOOGOO as their opening for the tour. And it was a good piece of opening music for the beginning, because they'd start playing it, and Oh my God, I thought I'd heard some screaming at Duran. When they started touring, it just led me to a whole new level of piercing screams. So, it was, and there's a track, it's the last track on side 2, Freo. I really love that track. It's very atmospheric. It's about freedom, and it was just about the time when Poland were trying to get away from the Iron Curtain, and that's what inspired it. And it meant it just had that dark quality that was, I sort of thought was very, in my opinion, because I hadn't been to Eastern Europe then, but as I've listened to it since, it does have a quality that's very Eastern European. And probably that's one of the reasons why the record was, if it was big in England, it was massive. When the album came out, it was massive in Europe. I can't even begin to tell you. So that was what happened then. And then they decided they were going to do a tour. And because of, hearing what went on tours, but, Debbie told me, and you and Kathy and Vonnie and all these people, we decided, about 7 of us, that we were going to go on the whole tour. And we had never done this before. And this is how me and going to tours, enormous amounts of dates, not just one. That's how this started. So much to the disgust of their manager, who was called Paul Ryan. The band always used to tell us what they were doing. So anyway, they told us that they were going on tour and they were going to be doing a warm-up date at a place called Chippenham in Wiltshire, at a club called Gold Diggers, and we decided we'd go. So I took some time off work. The tour was going to take place over about a month, and we decided that some of the gigs were probably a little bit too far to go, like Aberdeen, but we went to Glasgow. Some of them were a little bit too far to go, or we couldn't sort of work it out. But things that happened on the tour, we went to this warm-up gig in Gold Diggers, and to our horror, we discovered, because it was a nightclub, that the band weren't even going to be on till 11 o'clock. So we missed our coach home, and we thought that we'd all just have to, sit outside the venue until it got, daylight, and there'd be a coach again at 5:30 in the morning or something like that, and we were just going to sit there. And so we were sitting at the back, and the band were gone, and we didn't tell them that we were stranded. I'm sure they would have done something about it, because they were those sort of guys. They were really nice guys, KAJAGOOGOO'S. They were not horrible, and they were not musicians in the way that a lot of rock bands, if it had been Oasis, they would have just laughed at us probably and poured a bucket of water over us and run away. But, they were nice. They probably would have helped us out, like paid for a taxi even from there, or whatever. But anyway, we were sitting at the back, and the crew were getting all the rig down as they did. And, they were just chatting, what are you lot all doing out here? And we said, we've missed our bus. And they said, look, why don't you go and sit on our coach, because it will be warmer. And so we sat on the coach, and they brought us cups of tea and stuff. It was really nice, the crew. And then they said, why don't you just come to Margate, which is the first official gig the next day. So we did do that. And then we were already, of course, in the venue with the crew by the time the band got there, and they were like, what are you lot doing here? So that was quite funny, because we'd all gone, and then we went to, whatever we sort of trundled around. And I remember we did a few more missed transport things. And then the other thing, of course, that we were doing, and I was sort of doing this a bit before, friend Debbie had said, one day, oh, I'm going to go to Top of the Pops this week. Do you want to come? And I said, well, have you got tickets? She said, oh, no. She said, we'll just climb in over the wall. Once you were inside the wall at TB Centre, they assumed that you had tickets or you were supposed to be there. And then you could just march round the thing, find wherever they were recording Top of the Pops. And if you were lucky, you just used to follow the people in and nobody asked you for your ticket. If you were unlucky, then they would chase you out the building. But yes, there's quite a few Top of the Popses where you can see me in those days, 82, 83, 84 in the audience, if you know where to look. And then going on the tour, we met the support band, who I'm still in touch with, the lead singer from them, who were called H2O. And then when they decided to do a separate tour, having supported KAJAGOOGOO'S for a month, they decided to do a tour themselves, and we went on loads of dates for that. And I was wise by then, I knew about things. And so a lot of things I learned, I knew about transport and how to get from A to B, and things like being on the guest list. I mean, Kaj did that for us. They dedicated a song to us at, I think it was Birmingham, and they were a very good live band. Lamar was a fantastic frontman. And they were a very good live band, and they could play their instruments properly. They sung in tune. They, the light show and a proper set, and it was all, very slick. But that's why I love this album, because it reminds me of a whole load of things that I would not have got into if it wasn't for this. Anyway, I achieved my aim of being the number one fan because in about 2003 or 2004, they did some reunion gigs, and I'd been working abroad and I didn't really know anything about it. And we hadn't got, we'd only just got social media then, so I wasn't really in touch with the band or anything at that point. And I came back from abroad and I turned on the television one morning, and I looked at it and I thought, oh God, that guy looks like Lamar. And then they panned the camera back a bit, and I thought, oh, but that looks like Nick Beggs, and that can't be right because KAJAGOOGOO had a seismic breakup the end of '83 before their second album. And it turns out it was them. And so the tour that they were doing as a reunion tour was nearly all over. And I couldn't go to one of the gigs, so I trailed myself down to Southampton. I was on my own, and I was talking to the sound guy, at the back of the thing. And after the gig, he said, oh, I didn't ask you. He said, what is your connection to the band? And I said, well, I'm not their most dedicated fan, but I am their first fan. And he said, hold on a minute. And then he came back about 5 minutes later and said, come with me. And I sort of followed this guy through the bowels of the brook in Southampton. And I followed him all the way in there. And then he opened the door of this room, and there was the band, and they all turned around at one moment and went, oh my God, Lulu. And obviously they clearly did remember me. So that was all great. And so now we're all back in touch.
How did you feel when they opened the door and they all
They were
called
all
your name
there.
out?
Oh, well, I was flabbergasted. I'm not going to lie. It's my second most favourite moment, probably after meeting David Bowie, which they'll all be thrilled to know about. Yeah, so KAJAGOOGOO have led me into other things that
They've opened up a lot of doors for you,
yeah,
haven't they? By the
they
sound of
absolutely
it.
have.
Well, it's a good point just to touch back on the album. So let's think about White Feathers itself as an album, because a lot of people, I think, probably unfairly, KAJAGOOGOO just do get reduced to that song, don't they?
Yeah,
Too
they do.
Shy. One soundbite, one haircut. But actually, when I've listened this week to this album, I actually think it's a really carefully constructed and ambitious pop album, and I'm really enjoying listening to it. So we know how you got to hear it. Got to hear it before anybody else because you were the OG fan, getting invited
Yeah.
in and listening to the studio recordings. What do you think it sounds like now when you listen to it? Do you think time has helped the album, or is it just like you're transported right back to listening to in the studio with the band when you hear it?
I think that this album is such a product of 1980s. I mean, it goes with all of those things that were in those movies like Fame, Breakfast Club, leg warmers, big hair, all the things that you think are 1980s, and this album is one of them. Because people, when they think of 1980s, they sort of think of Blitz kids, or I suppose they call them new romantics a bit. But really, if you go to an 80s night, everybody will be there wearing leg warmers and neon and stuff like that, and with their hair all backcombed. And that is, with a lot of lacquer. And this is that album, that goes, it's the only album that I own that is like that. I think that for 1983, this is such a product of its age. I mean, even looking at the cover, the inside sleeve with that photograph of them all there artfully lit with the shadows behind them. It's so 1980s, isn't it?
I'm literally just looking at it now. They've got that 1980s footwear on.
Totally.
Of the you'll tell me the guy wearing the black leather pants.
That's Stuart. Yeah, he loved a bit of black. He loved black leather. Stuart did. And it's like you can smell the hairspray, can't you, from looking at this picture?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and then you've got
much
the big hair and the earrings for the person on the left hand side next to Lamal.
That's Nick Beggs, and that hair, which has got beads in it. Oh my God, the beaded hair. Nick's hair is not like that anymore. He has very long hair, quite normally. He looks like a rock star. Nick Beggs, he's quite prolific on social media. But I have to tell people who are listening to this, if you look him up, be prepared to see a green mankini. You've been warned. Just be prepared. It's a bit of a
So,
running joke with him. Anyway.
so how did Too Shy, the single, take off to be such a mega hit? I mean, that's one of those songs that I've grown up with in the background of my life that I probably never really would gravitate towards, but you hear it so often. What was the sort of genesis of it being such a big hit?
Well, actually, it was to do with a guy who used to be on Radio 1 called Paul Gambaccini. He met, I'm going to say Lamal, a lot of it was, he met Lamal, and because of that meeting, when Lamal sent him the single, he played it. And it got onto Radio 1 had a playlist and you needed to be on it really, and if you were on it, it got played all the time, and it just got played. Um, and of course, when the video for it was all very slick and glossy and MTV, and they are um, you know, young guys looking fashionable at the time and things, so it was just all a combination of things. And it just fitted into that moment. And that's why that's why I say the album is such a product of its time. It just fitted into that moment when, people had, a little bit of money. We'd just come out the hideous 70s and all those, the 3-day week and Margaret Thatcher and all of that. We'd all sort of finished all of that. And it was just a song that you don't, it's not political. It's not, it's not trying to make a point. It's not trying to tell you something or teach you something. It's just a song that everybody can hear. You can, even if you don't like it, you can understand what it's talking about. You know what the subject is. It's really just, one of those songs. You don't need to know the band or like the band. You hear that song and you just think, that's a great track. Um, it just gets into your head. You find yourself singing it even when you're thinking to yourself, I hate KAJAGOOGOO. And then you find yourself singing to Too Shy.
Like lightning in a bottle, basically. It was
Yeah, it sort of was.
right time, right place, and it all the things it needed to be a hit were all present, and it just became a bit of a monster then, didn't it?
Yeah, it totally did. And, the subsequent single, which was Utabia, that actually was better on the 12-inch mix than it actually was on the 7-inch pop version. But, it was quite catchy. And then they released Hang On Now, which then it was sort of a thing, really, that bands, you did a couple of singles and then you did a ballad of some sort, and they sort of did. And I was not keen, which I probably said about a million times to them on it. I'm just not a ballad sort of girl with that sort of ballad anyway. But that they only released the 3 singles off this, and then they made another album. And in those days, you did, unless you were Michael Jackson and released every track off your album, pretty much.
Pretty much.
Yeah, you really did do that. It was 3 singles, and then you got the rest of the album. And I do think there's tracks on here that I would call fillers. I mean, you've got to call the instrumental, much as it was a great instrumental for introducing the band at gig, the instrumental KAJAGOOGOO, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what I call a filler, which people tended to put onto albums. But this has got some, White Feathers has got some, a 1 or 2. This car is fast. Don't really know what was going on with that either. It just seemed like probably seemed like a good idea to them at the time.
This this album's travelled with you for a lot of years now.
Yeah.
I mean, when do you listen to it now? And if you do, is it just nostalgia and the fact that you had that amazing time and it opened doorways, or are there elements of this now musically that you can maybe look back on now? Maybe you didn't appreciate at the time, but now you do, or vice versa.
I have played it occasionally, actually. I mean, I've played it recently because I knew I was going to do this, but I have listened to it a few times. I listened to it when I found it again because I've only been redoing my vinyl collection for a few years. But yeah, so I still play this. I put it on from time to time, and I do still love some of the tracks on it. I still love Lies and Promises on it, and I still love, as I've said earlier, I still love Freo. I don't hate any of the tracks. They've got a track called Monochromatic, which didn't make it onto the album, that I really, really did. It was a B-side. And that had a really great guitar bit in it. And Ergonomics has a little bit of that guitar as well. That's Steve Askew doing the fabulous guitar work. On the other hand, I'm quite critical with bands. I don't think, even with David Bowie, I don't think that there's any band I can think of that I've bought every album that they've ever done and thought they were all fabulous. I'm not that person. I know there are some people that are. I am not that person. But on the whole, this album, it goes on, and there's no part of it that I think I hate this track, I need to skip it. You know how you do, especially on CD. When this plays in the background, it plays all the way through. I don't hate any of it. It still sounds to me very 80s.
Totally
Yeah.
agree. Lulu, we always close the podcast with a Friday spin, a recommendation of something that you might want to give to the listeners. It could be old, it could be new. Is there anything you want to recommend?
I'm going to say that my Friday spin is going to be Exodus, which is an album by Bob Marley, and it's very old. And it's one of those albums that's like Tapestry by Carole King, the sort of album that people hear it talked about and they don't know what it actually is. And I just think, because I nearly chose this as my album, it's such a great album by Bob Marley, who wrote many fantastic songs, and 3 or 4 of them are on this album. And I think that for people, the influence of Bob Marley, I mean, his influence is so massive on so many people and genres and songs. So that's what I'm going to choose. Exodus by Bob Marley. Everyone should play Bob Marley at some point in their lives because he's another genius. Bob Marley's up there with Neil Finn, Barry Gibb, David Bowie, and a few others, genius songwriters that those of us go to see them or hear them, we are touched by their genius. And I feel blessed, quite frankly, that I have been.
In fact, one of our musical heroes in common, Neil Finn, often cites Bob Marley as one of his musical heroes. And one day, and I'm manifesting, Lulu, that Neil Finn comes on this podcast, and I do wonder whether he'd bring a Bob Marley record.
Oh,
That'd be
wouldn't
quite
that be
interesting.
good? I did not know that Neil was such a fan, and I know, of course, that he is second only to me as a Bowie fan, of course. But I did not know that he although you probably, to be honest, when you think about it, people that write songs that are as good as that, they probably generate to people that also write great songs. Another person who's up there for me for writing great songs, and this is going to kill my credibility as well, Gary Barlow. Honestly, take that, some of his solo efforts, that you just cannot argue with some of those songs. You just can't. It doesn't matter whether you hate them, you know what they are. You know them instantly. And
I'm now lost for words how we've gone from this absolute wide-spanning musical landscape and journey of yours, Lulu, to end the podcast on Gary Barlow. But
yes,
there we have it. There we have it. Lulu, Lulu, thank you so much for bringing your journey to the Friday Vinyl Club. Did you enjoy that?
Oh, I totally did. I love talking about music. I don't get enough opportunity, to be honest, Jamie. I really don't.
No.
And I love talking about it.
It's been an absolutely fantastic, wide-ranging conversation and a real pleasure listening to your stories. And honestly, we could talk for hours and hours more around them. To our listeners, you'll find a few companion tracks from White Feathers from KAJAGOOGOO on our companion playlist, the Friday Vinyl Club playlist. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow, share, leave us a rating or a comment. It really helps a small family podcast grow without ads or sponsorship. And until next time, keep your record spinning and your stories alive. This has been Friday Vinyl Club with Lulu, talking about KAJAGOOGOO and White Feathers and everything in between. Thanks, Lulu. Really appreciate that.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jamie.